Welcome to our sleep video series, your easiest path to drifting off naturally. These videos are designed to gently guide your mind toward rest. They work in a few simple ways. First, we give your mind something lightly engaging to focus on, not too exciting, not too dull. Just enough to keep your thoughts from wandering, but not enough to keep you awake. Next, through our proprietary neuro-relaxation technique, the pacing of the audio gradually slows as the video progresses. This subtle change encourages your mind to slow with it. The slowdown doesn't happen in a straight line. It follows carefully crafted patterns proven to support deeper relaxation. Finally, every element of the audio is intentionally calm, steady, and pleasantly boring, perfect for helping your mind settle into sleep. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe so you always have a new video ready for bedtime. And in return for these videos, we ask just one small favor. Please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, your city, state, or country, and what time it is for you. It motivates our team, helps us understand what's working, and builds a worldwide community of people who fall asleep together each night. It's always inspiring to see how others use these videos. Now, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let yourself unwind.
Call me a fool or call me a simpleton, but before the world turned black, I loved the stairs. That is where it always began, you see. Not with the rope or the bronze or the sound that could shake the fillings out of a man's teeth, but with the stairs. 312 of them. I counted them every morning and every evening, a ritual of stone and sweat. 1, 2, 3. The cold bite of the granite through the thin soles of my boots. 4, 5, 6. The smell of damp moss clinging to the narrow, arrow slits that let in thin, dusty blades of sunlight. To anyone else in the village of Oakhaven, that climb was a punishment. For me, it was an ascension. It was leaving the mud and the manure and the petty squabbles of the market square behind. Up there, in the belfry, the air was thinner, cleaner. Up there, I wasn't just Jeff, the lanky fellow with the big ears and the hands that were too large for his pockets. I was the keeper of the voice. I was the heartbeat of the valley. You have to understand, back then, before the sickness, the bells were not things of dread. They were the music of life. We had 3 of them. Great Thomas was the tenor, a massive, pot-bellied beast of iron and bronze that grumbled low in your chest. He was for Sundays and solemnities. Then there was Catherine, the alto, sweet and clear, the voice of weddings and feast days. And finally, little Pip. Pip was the scrapper, the high-pitched chatterbox used for the morning wake-up and the market open. I knew them better than I knew my own mother. I knew that Catherine needed a gentle touch, a coaxing pull, or she'd sound tinny. I knew that Great Thomas required you to throw your entire soul into the rope, to hang there suspended in the air for a breathless second before gravity and momentum took over. We were a team, the 4 of us. Let me paint you a picture of a Tuesday morning in glorious June, the year of our Lord 1348. It feels like a dream now, sharp and bright and impossibly distant. The sun would hit the eastern face of the tower first, warming the stone. I'd be up there with Pip, looking down on the tapestry of thatched roofs and winding lanes. From that height, Oakhaven was perfect. I could see Miller John dragging his sacks of flour, looking like a white-dusted beetle. I could see the smoke curling from the bakery, smelling of yeast even from 200 feet up. I would wrap my hands around Pip's rope, the hemp polished smooth by generations of ringers before me, and wait. Precision was my pride. I waited for the sun to fully clear the Hawk's Ridge. I waited until the shadow of the tower touched the edge of the town well, and then, cling-clang, cling-clang. The sound didn't just go out, it bloomed. It washed over the houses like invisible water. And down below, the world woke up. I saw shutters throw open. I saw the blacksmith, huge Barnaby, step out and stretch, looking up at the tower with a wave. He couldn't see me, not really, just a silhouette in the arch, but he knew I was there. We had an understanding. The village and they gave me bread and cheese and a few coins, and I gave them time. I gave them order. Without me, how would they know when to pray, when to eat, when to lay down their tools? I was the clockwork of God, or so I liked to tell myself when I was feeling particularly proud. Coming down from the tower was always a celebration. My arms would buzz with the residual vibration, a pleasant hum that settled in the marrow of my bones. Walking through the market was a gauntlet of greetings. "Morning, Jeff, you were sharp today." Old Widow Gable would shout from her vegetable stall, tossing me a carrot which I'd catch with a grin. "Bit late on the terce ring, weren't you, lad?" The friar would tease, his eyes twinkling. He knew I was never late. I was the standard by which lateness was measured. "Only if the sun is dragging its feet, father," I'd shoot back. It was a good life. A simple life. I had a small room at the back of the rectory, a straw mattress that smelled of dried lavender, and a cat named Soot who was deaf as a post, which made him the perfect companion for a bell ringer. My days were measured in swings of the pendulum. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. The rhythm of the church was the rhythm of my blood. And the weddings? Oh, God, the weddings. That was when Catherine sang. There's a specific way to ring a wedding peal. You don't just pull, you skip. You let the clapper dance against the rim so the sound tumbles over itself like children rolling down a hill. I remember ringing for the potter's daughter, Alara. She was a beauty, with hair like spun wheat. When she walked out of the church doors with her new husband, I was up there, sweating and laughing, making Catherine shout simply because I knew Alara was listening. I looked down and saw the confetti of flower petals, the dancing, the ale casks being breached. I felt like I was showering them with blessings from the sky. I felt essential. I felt loved. But sound travels, and sometimes it brings things you don't want to hear. It started as a whisper. Not a bell, but a low, discordant hum that came with the traders from the coast. The port cities were always full of strange tales, two-headed calves, fish that talked, storms that rained frogs. So when the wool merchant, a sour-faced man named Silas, stopped his cart by the tavern in late August, I didn't pay much mind to his rambling. I was sitting on the tavern bench, nursing a pint of small beer, resting my hands which were raw from a long funeral toll earlier that day. Old Man Weaver had finally passed. "It's not like a fever," Silas was saying, his voice dropping low, drawing the listeners in. "It's a shadow. It takes the strong and the weak alike. In Bristol, they say the cemeteries are full. They're digging trenches." "Bah," Barnaby the smith waved a hand, soot falling from his sleeve. "Traders talk, trying to drive up the price of wool by scaring us." "I tell you," Silas insisted, his eyes darting around as if the sickness were listening. "It comes on the wind, or on the rats. No one knows, but you see a black swelling here." He pointed to his groin, then his armpit, "and you're dead by sundown. Your blood turns to black water." I took a sip of my beer, looking at the blue sky. It seemed impossible. The harvest was coming in, golden and heavy. The air smelled of apples and wood smoke. Sickness was a winter thing, a damp thing. It didn't belong in this golden light. "Jeff," Silas turned to me, "you're high up. You see things coming. Have you seen the smoke? They burn the houses of the dead in the south." "I see the clouds," I said, feeling the eyes of the room on me. "I see the hawks. I don't see any death." "You will," he muttered, turning back to his drink. "You will." I walked back to the tower that evening with a strange itch between my shoulder blades. I climbed the stairs, 1, 2, 3, but the rhythm felt off. The air in the stairwell felt stagnant, heavy. When I reached the top, I looked south. The horizon was a hazy purple line. Was that smoke, or just the mist rising from the marshes? I told myself it was mist. I gripped Great Thomas's rope for vespers. I needed the sound. I needed to blast the fear away with volume. I rang hard that night, doong, doong. "I am here," the bell seemed to say. "We are here, we are safe." But the weeks dragged on, and the rumors thickened. They stopped being stories from distant lands and became stories from the next county. Then, the next town. The joy began to leak out of Oakhaven like water from a cracked cup. The market grew quieter. People stopped lingering to gossip. They bought their turnips and their flour and hurried home, bolting their doors. The friar, usually a man of boundless optimism, grew pale. He spent more time in the chapel, kneeling on the stone, praying in a frantic whisper. He stopped teasing me about being late. He barely looked at me. "Wash the bells, Jeff," he told me one morning in September. "Wash them, Father." With holy water and vinegar. His hands were shaking. "Purify the voice of God. Maybe if the sound is pure enough, it will keep the demons at bay. The air is corrupt, Jeff. The bells move the air. If we cleanse the bells, we cleanse the air." It sounded mad, but fear makes madmen of us all, so I hauled buckets up those 312 steps. My legs burned. My back screamed. I scrubbed the bronze lips of Great Thomas. I washed the delicate curve of Catherine. I polished little Pip until he shone like a new coin. The vinegar stung my nose, mixing with the smell of bird droppings and old dust. I rang them that evening, and they did sound different. Sharper, more desperate, or maybe that was just me. The turning point came on a Tuesday. It's funny how tragedies love a Tuesday. It was a gray day, unseasonably cold. The fog had rolled in off the river, wrapping the tower in a wet blanket. I couldn't see the ground from the belfry. I was ringing in an island of stone floating in a white sea. I had finished the morning ring and was descending the stairs. 210, 209. I heard shouting below, not the market shouting. This was a jagged, panic sound, the sound of an animal caught in a trap. I hurried, my boots slapping against the stone. I burst out of the tower door into the square. A cart had stopped near the well. It wasn't a merchant's cart. It was a simple farm wagon, piled high with straw. A horse, thin and foaming at the mouth, stood trembling in the traces. A man was violently pulling something off the back of the wagon. No, not something. Someone. "Help," he screamed. "For the love of Christ, help us." The crowd that had gathered was standing back, a wide circle of empty space around the wagon. I pushed through the back rank. "What is it?" I asked Barnaby, who was holding a hammer as a weapon. "Strangers," Barnaby growled. "From the valley. They shouldn't be here. We closed the road blocks." "My wife," the man by the cart sobbed. He had lowered a woman onto the cobblestones. She was limp, her breathing ragged and wet, like a saw cutting through wet wood. The friar came running from the church, his robes flapping. He stopped 10 feet away. The silence that fell over the crowd was heavier than the Great Thomas. "She is sick," the man pleaded, looking up, his face streaked with mud and tears. "She just needs rest. She just needs a bed." The woman groaned, and her shawl slipped. I saw it, we all saw it. On her neck, just below the ear, was a swelling. It was the size of a goose egg, dark and angry, black in the center and rimmed with an angry purple. It looked like a bruise from the devil's own thumb. The collective intake of breath from the village sucked the air out of the square. "Plague," someone whispered. The word hung there. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It wasn't a story from the coast. It was here, on our cobblestones, by our well. "Get back," the friar yelled, his voice cracking. He held up his wooden cross like a shield. "Do not touch her. Do not breathe near her." "Father, please," the husband cried, reaching out. "Back," the friar turned to me. His eyes were wide, terrifyingly white in his flushed face. "Jeff, the tower." "Father," I stammered. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "The tower, you fool. Ring." "Ring what? The alarm, the fire bell." "No," the friar pointed a shaking finger at the woman, at the black mark of death on her neck. "Ring the dead knell, but not the slow one. Continuous. Ring it until your hands bleed. Warn them. Tell the farmers. Tell the shepherds. Tell them death is in Oakhaven." I looked at the woman. I looked at the horror on Barnaby's face. The idyllic world, the world of wedding peels and heavy flour sacks and sun-warmed stone, shattered into 1,000 pieces. I turned and ran. Back into the dark throat of the tower. 1, 2, 3. I didn't count this time. I scrambled. I tripped, skinned my shin, scrambled up again. My breath tore at my lungs. The stairs seemed to stretch out forever, a nightmare tunnel. I had to get to the top. I had to warn them. I burst into the belfry, the cold air hitting my sweating face. I didn't go to Catherine. She was for joy. I didn't go to Pip. He was for the morning. I went to Great Thomas. I grabbed the rope. It felt different now. It wasn't warm, it was cold, dead fiber. I didn't feel like the keeper of the voice anymore. I felt like an executioner. I pulled, I threw my weight down, harder than I ever had. Dong. The sound was monstrous. It wasn't a call to prayer. It was a scream made of iron. It rolled out over the fog, over the silent houses, over the fields where the harvest lay waiting. It told the story that no words could manage. Dong. I looked down through the floor slats, through the gaps, imagining the scene below. The circle widening, the fear taking root. Dong. This was it, the music had stopped. The noise had begun. I was no longer ringing for the glory of God. I was ringing for the end of the world. And as I hauled on that rope, tears stinging my eyes, I realized with a sick, sinking dread that I might never stop ringing it. The rumors were true. The shadow had landed. And I, Jeff the Ringer, was the one who had to announce it. Dong. The vibration shook my teeth, but for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely unmatched by the bell. I was small. I was fragile. And the death down below was hungry. I kept ringing, because it was all I knew how to do, because if I stopped, the silence would be worse. Dong. And so, the long nightmare began. End of segment 1. == The silence that followed that first confirmation was heavy, a physical weight that seemed to press down on the thatched roofs and the cobblestone streets. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning before the market opened, nor the hush of a winter night. It was a holding of breath. The town council, in their infinite and panicked wisdom, had decided that silence was dangerous, that ignorance was the fuel of the pestilence. So, they looked to me. They looked to the bell tower. I remember standing in the nave of the church, the stone floor cold enough to seep through the leather of my boots. Father Anselm wouldn't look me in the eye. He was staring at the crucifix, his hands trembling just slightly, rubbing a pouch of dried herbs that smelled of rosemary and desperation. He told me that the great bells, the ones referring to God and glory, were to remain still. Those bells, the ones I had named and polished and loved like children, were for the living. And there was very little living happening now. Instead, he handed me the iron handbell. It was an ugly thing, cast poorly with a handle of rough-hewn ash wood that hadn't been sanded down properly. It didn't sing. It clattered. It was a jagged, abrasive noise designed to cut through stone walls and thick oak doors. It was the sound of authorization. My orders were simple, terrifyingly so. I was to walk the perimeter of the infected districts, which day by day was becoming simply the district, and I was to ring the iron bell. I was to precede the cart. I loved my tower. I loved the height of it, the way the wind whipped around the belfry, cleaning the air, making me feel like I was above the grime of the world. But you cannot ring the handbell from the tower. You have to be in the mud. The first morning of the new order was gray, a low mist clinging to the riverbanks. I stepped out of the church vestry, the iron bell heavy in my right hand, a cloth soaked in vinegar tied around my nose and mouth. It made my eyes water, the sharp acidic sting battling the other smell, the one we all pretended we couldn't smell yet, the sweetness of rot. I walked to the edge of the tanner's quarter. This was where the first case had been. The street was empty. It wasn't just empty of people, it was empty of life. Usually, there would be chickens scratching in the dirt, a stray dog looking for scraps, the sound of a hammer on an anvil. Now, there was nothing but the damp stones and the shut shutters. I raised the bell. My arm felt stiff, reluctant. I gave it a swing. Clang-clack, clang-clack. The sound was hideous. It echoed off the timber-framed houses, bouncing back at me with a mocking flatness. I took a step. Clang-clack. "Bring out your dead," the carter called out from behind me. His voice was muffled by his own rags. He didn't sound sad. He sounded bored. That was the first thing that truly turned my stomach, the boredom of the inevitable. I kept walking, my eyes darting to the windows. I saw movement in the cracks of the shutters. Eyes, terrified, white-trimmed eyes peering out, watching the procession of the doomed. I used to wave at these people. I knew them. That house there, with the blue paint chipping off the door, that was Miller John's place. He had a laugh that could shake the ale off a table. Now, his door was marked. A crudely painted cross in red ochre huddled on the wood, marking the territory of the death within. As I passed, I didn't hear a laugh. I heard a low, rhythmic moaning, a sound of fevered dreams and agony that leaked through the walls. I rang the bell harder, trying to drown it out. Clang-clack. I told myself I was doing a duty. I was warning the healthy to stay away. I was the lighthouse keeper warning ships off the rocks, but I didn't feel like a savior. I felt like the Grim Reaper's herald. By the third day, the novelty of the fear had worn off, replaced by a grinding misery. The quarantine was in full effect. No one in, no one out. The village had turned into a series of islands, each house a fortress against the invisible enemy. I walked my route, the leather of the bell handle wearing a blister into my palm. The isolation was paradoxical. I was the most visible man in the village, yet I was completely alone. When people saw me coming, they didn't wave, they slammed their windows. Mothers pulled children deep into the recesses of their homes. I was the walking symbol that something had ended. Even the stray cats hissed at me. I found myself retreating to the tower whenever my shift was done. I would climb the spiral stairs until my legs burned, desperate for the altitude. Up there, with the wind howling, I could pretend the world below was just sleeping. I would sit under the great bronze rim of Old Gabriel, my favorite tenor bell, and eat my ration of bread and hard cheese. I checked my body compulsively. A twitch in the arm? Is that a swelling? A catch in the throat? Is that the blood coming? The paranoia was a companion that sat right next to me, whispering that the itch on my neck was the end of the story. But the bell had to be rung. The dead did not stop coming, and so the ringer could not stop walking. On the fifth day, the sensory assault changed. The smell of vinegar on my mask was no longer enough. The autumn heat had lingered, unnatural and humid, turning the village into a stew. The scent of the sickness was distinct. It smelled like old copper and spoiled meat. It hung in the alleys where the air didn't move. I turned the corner onto Weaver's Row, the iron bells swinging in a grim metronome rhythm. This was a wealthier street. The houses were taller, the wood darker. I saw a door open ahead of me. It wasn't a slow creak, it was thrown open. A woman stumbled out. It was cryptic, silent grief. She wasn't weeping, she was gasping, her hands clutching at her apron. I knew her. It was Sarah, the baker's wife. She used to give me the burnt ends of the loaves when I came down from Sunday ringing. She looked at me, and for a second I saw a flash of recognition, a plea for the way things used to be. Then she saw the bell in my hand. Her expression collapsed from grief into horror. She recoiled, backing up until she hit the doorframe. She wasn't scared of the plague anymore. She was scared of *me*. I was the end. I was the signal that hope had left the building. "Not yet," she whispered, though the street was so quiet I heard it clearly from 20 paces. "Not yet, he's just sleeping." Behind me, the cart wheels creaked, a sound like grinding teeth. The carter paused his mule. "Sarah," I said, my voice sounded rusty, unused. "Go back inside, Sarah." "He's just cold," she said, her voice rising to a brittle pitch. "He's just cold, Jeff. You don't need to ring that thing. Stop ringing that thing." I lowered the bell. The silence rushed back in, deafening. "I have to, Sarah. It's the law. It's for the neighbors." "The neighbors are dead," she screamed, the facade breaking. She pointed a trembling finger at the house next door, then the one across. "They're all dead. Stop ringing. We know, God, we know." She collapsed onto the step, sobbing into her skirts. The carter didn't wait. He clicked his tongue, urged the mule forward to check the house himself. I stood there, the iron bell feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I wanted to throw it into the river. I wanted to run to her, to help her up, to offer comfort. But I couldn't touch her. I couldn't touch anyone. An invisible wall of pestilence stood between my hand and her shoulder. I walked past her. I had to. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, took a breath of vinegar air, and swung the bell. Clang-clack. It felt like a betrayal. It felt like I was striking her with it. That night, the tower felt colder. The wind had shifted, coming from the north, bringing a chill that should have killed the vapors but only seemed to freeze the despair in place. I sat on the wooden floorboards, looking out the louvers of the belfry. The village was dark. Usually there would be candles, hearth fires glowing through windows. Now, fuel was being conserved, or perhaps people just couldn't bear to see what was inside their own rooms. There were bonfires burning on the outskirts, though. Great pyres designated for the overflow. The orange glow flickered against the low clouds, lighting up the underbellies of the smoke. It looked like the gates of hell had been constructed just past the mill. I tried to sleep, but the sound of the iron bell was stuck in my ear. It had replaced my heartbeat. Every time I drifted off, I jerked awake, hand clutching at a rope that wasn't there. The next morning was Sunday, but there was no mass. The church doors were barred. Father Anselm was inside. I could hear him chanting sometimes, a low drone of Latin meant to keep the devil at bay, but he wouldn't open the doors. I was the only one allowed to move freely, a privilege that felt like a curse. I decided to alter my route. It was a small rebellion, meaningless in the grand scheme, but I needed to see something familiar that wasn't tainted. I needed to see Thomas. Thomas was a wheelwright, a man of immense shoulders and a heart that was too soft for his trade. We had spent 1,000 evenings at the Boar's Head, arguing about which king was the worst and whether ale tasted better from wood or clay cups. He lived on the edge of the village, near the woods. The air was cleaner there. Surely, the bad air hadn't reached the edge of the woods. I convinced myself that checking on him was official business. I had to patrol the perimeter, didn't I? I left the carter behind in the square. He was busy arguing with a merchant about the fee for removal, and I walked alone toward Thomas's cottage. The walk felt lighter without the cart trailing me. The leaves were turning, vibrant golds and reds creating a canopy that almost made you forget the ground was poisoned. I found myself walking faster. I hadn't seen Thomas in 10 days. He had been talking about fixing his roof before the snows came. I bet he was up there right now, hammering away, oblivious to the horror in the square. I turned up the dirt path to his cottage. It was quiet, too quiet. There was no sound of a hammer. The chimney was cold, no smoke rose from it. "Thomas," I called out, lowering the mask from my face for a moment to shout. "Thomas, you lazy oaf, are you still in bed?" There was no answer. The birds in the trees seemed to stop singing to listen. I approached the door. It wasn't marked. There was no red cross. Relief washed over me, cool and sweet. He was fine. He had probably just fled, gone to his cousin's farm in the next valley. Smart man. I reached for the latch, forgetting myself. My hand hovered inches from the wood. "Don't touch," the voice in my head screamed. "Never touch." I knocked with the handle of the iron bell. Thud, thud, thud. "Thomas, open up, it's Jeff. I've got news from the village, it's a mess down there." I heard a shuffle, a slow, dragging sound, like a sack of grain being pulled across floorboards. My stomach tightened. It wasn't the step of a man walking to welcome a friend. The door didn't open, but a voice came from right behind it. It was close, intimate, but stripped of all its timbre. "Jeff." "I'm here, Tom. Open up, I need to talk to someone who isn't dying." A pause, a long, wheezing breath rattled through the wood. "Go away, Jeff." The words hit me harder than the smell had. "What? Don't be stupid. Open the door. I'm the ringer. I'm allowed to be out." "I know what you are," Thomas rasped. "I heard your bell, even out here, I heard it." "Thomas, open the door." "I can't." "Why?" "Because my hands, they don't work right today, Jeff, and I don't want you to see me, not like this." The world tilted. The golden leaves, the fresh air, the hope of the perimeter, it all drained away, leaving everything gray. "Tom, do you have the markings?" "I have the knots," he whispered. "Under the arm, size of an apple, burning, Jeff. It burns like the devil's own poker." My hand gripped the iron bell until my knuckles were white. I stared at the wood grain of the door, counting the rings in the timber, because if I stopped counting, I would scream. Thomas was the strongest man I knew. He could lift an ox cart axle on his own. "I can get Father Anselm," I stammered, lying. "I can get water, I can bring you food." "I don't need food," Thomas said. I need you to do something for me. Anything. Don't mark the door. The request hung in the air. The law was absolute. All infected houses must be marked. The cart must know where to stop. Tom. Please, his voice cracked, a wet, tearing sound. I don't want to die staring at a red cross. I want to die in my house. Just come back when it's quiet, when I stop answering. Just you, don't bring the cart yet. Give me a day. Just one day of being a man, not a corpse. I looked back down the path toward the village. I could see the thin trails of smoke from the bonfires. I looked at the iron bell in my hand, the instrument of my new trade. Jeff. I'm here, I choked out. Promise me. I swallowed the lump of bile and grief in my throat. I promise, Tom, no paint today. Good man, he whispered. Now get away, the air is bad here. Run, bell ringer, run. I backed away. I didn't turn my back on the door until I was at the tree line. I didn't ring the bell. I held the clapper tight against the side of the metal so it wouldn't make a sound. I walked back toward the village, toward the smoke and the stench, carrying the silence of my friend's death sentence in my pocket. As I re-entered the square, the carter was waiting for me. He looked at me with those dead, bored eyes. Missed a spot? He asked, gesturing toward the woods. I looked at him, and for the first time I felt a surge of rage hot enough to burn through the fear. No, I lied, my voice flat and hard as the iron in my hand. Nothing there, just empty houses. I pulled the vinegar cloth back over my face. The tower loomed above me, dark and silent against the gray sky. I had to go back up. I had to wait. But the bells I loved were gone. I was just a man with a noisemaker, waiting for the world to end, one friend at a time. I raised the iron bell and swung it. Clang clack. Bring out your dead, I whispered. Equals. The silence in my own house was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating blankets of silence that lay over the wooden table, the cold hearth, and the empty side of the bed, where the straw mattress still held the faint depression of her shape. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dust motes dancing in a singular, cruel beam of morning light. My hand gripped the handle of the bell, the brass cold against my palm, biting into the calluses that had formed over years of joy, and now, over weeks of sorrow. Yesterday, I had rung the bell for the baker. 2 days ago, for the smith's apprentice. Last night in the dark, I didn't ring it. I just sat there and watched the last breaths leave the only person who made this village feel like a home. But the sun was up. The mist was clinging to the cobblestones outside, and the duty was waiting. They say grief is a heavy coat, but for me, it was the bell. It weighed 1,000 pounds as I lifted it from the table. I opened the door and stepped out into the gray soup of the morning. The air didn't smell like morning anymore. It used to smell of damp earth and baking bread, of wood smoke and animal feed. Now, it smelled of vinegar and burning sulfur, of rosemary bundles scorching in iron braziers, and under it all, that cloying, sickly sweet scent of corruption that no amount of burning herbs could mask. I took the first step, clang. Bring out your dead, I croaked. My voice was a stranger's voice. It was dry, like dead leaves scraping over stone. Clang. The vibration traveled up my arm, settling in the deep ache of my shoulder. This was why the job sucked. Not the walking, though my boots were worn through and my heels bled. Not the hours, though sleep was a memory. It was the transformation. Before the sickness, when I rang this bell, heads would pop out of windows. Children would chase me, asking for news of the fair or the tax collector. I was Jeff, the man who told them the time, the man who announced weddings. I was the heartbeat of the village. Now I was the heart attack. I walked down Tanner's Lane. The shutters were all drawn tight, barred from the inside as if wood and iron could keep the invisible death out. The street was empty, save for a stray dog with mange, chewing on something I tried not to look at. Clang. Bring out your dead. A window creaked open on the second floor of the Widow Gable's house. I paused, looking up, habitual hope rising in my chest. Maybe she needed water. Maybe she wanted to know if the doctor had come from the city. A basin of dirty water splashed onto the cobbles right in front of my boots, missing me by inches. "Get away, you vulture," she shrieked, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Don't you stop here. We're clean, your bell brings it. Take your noise and go to hell." The shutter slammed shut, with a finality that echoed down the alley. I wiped a splatter of sludge from my pants and kept walking. That was the new truth. They didn't see Jeff anymore. They saw a harbinger. They thought the sound of the brass tongue striking the lip of the bell was what summoned the reaper, as if I were casting a spell with every swing. They hated me because I was the only thing moving in a world that had stopped. I was the clock ticking down their remaining seconds. I turned onto the main thoroughfare. The fog was lifting slightly, revealing the devastation. It was a ghost town, but not empty. It was full of the feeling of eyes watching from cracks in the walls. The silence was perforated by the rumble of the cart behind me. I didn't look back. I knew who was there. Thomas and huge, silent Miller. They wore masks with long beaks stuffed with lavender, looking like demon birds, flightless and hungry. They didn't speak much anymore. They just lifted burdens that used to be people and stacked them like cordwood. Clang! We approached the cooper's shop. The door was painted with a red cross, the paint still dripping like a wound. I stopped. I had to. It was the rule. I rang the bell 3 times, a sharp, staccato rhythm to signal a collection. The door opened, and the cooper, a man who once laughed louder than anyone in the tavern, stepped out. He was gray, his eyes hollowed out, staring at nothing. He dragged a bundle wrapped in a linen sheet across the threshold. It was small, too small. I felt a twisting in my gut, a physical pain that mirrored the emptiness in my own house. I wanted to say something. I wanted to say, I know, Arthur. I lost mine too. I wanted to reach out and put a hand on his shoulder, to offer that tiny bridge of humanity that says, you are not alone in the dark. I took a step toward him, lowering the bell. "Arthur," I whispered. He flinched as if I had brandished a knife. He scrambled back, stumbling over his own feet, terror contorting his face. "Don't touch me," he screamed, his voice raw. "Don't you come near me. You're waiting for me, aren't you? You're just waiting to ring for me." He slammed the door. I heard the heavy thud of the bar dropping into place. I stood there, my hand half raised, the rejection stinging worse than the blisters on my feet. Thomas and Miller moved past me, silent and efficient. They hoisted the small bundle onto the cart. Thomas looked at me through the glass eyes of his mask. He didn't shrug. He didn't nod. He just pointed forward. "Keep moving." I gripped the bell tighter. Clang. This was the loneliness of the long-distance mourner. That's what I was. I mourned for every house I passed. The exhaustion was deep, settling in the marrow of my bones. My legs felt like lead, my arm was a knot of cramping muscle, but the mental fatigue was heavier. It was the weight of being the villain in everyone else's nightmare. I remembered how much I used to love the solitude of the early mornings, watching the sunrise from the bell tower. Now, the solitude was a prison. I walked through the market square, where stalls stood empty, canvas flapping in the wind like broken wings. A rat scurried across the display table where Mrs. Higgins used to sell apple tarts. I stopped by the well in the center of the square. I needed to drink, even if the water was stale. As I leaned the bell against the stone lip of the well, I heard a sound. It wasn't the rumble of the cart, which had lagged behind near the church. It was a whisper. "Bellman." I froze. I looked around. The square seemed empty. "Please, bellman." It was coming from the ground level of the apothecary's shop. A small, barred window near the cobblestones. I shouldn't go near. The rules were strict. Keep your distance. Ring the bell. Keep moving. But the voice, it sounded like her voice. I looked back. The cart was out of sight. I crouched down, my knees popping, and crept toward the window. The smell here was awful, a mix of rotting herbs and sickness. "I'm here," I whispered back, feeling a sudden, terrifying thrill of rebellion. "Who is it?" A hand appeared between the bars. It was pale, shaking, holding a folded piece of parchment. "My father," the voice whispered. It was a young woman. He's gone, but he wrote this for his brother in the next village. Please, he said you knew the way. He said you were a good man. A good man? The words hit me like a physical blow. Tears pricked my eyes, instantly hot and blurring my vision. For weeks, I had been a ghoul, a crow, a curse. To be remembered as a good man felt like salvation. I can't leave the village, I whispered, my voice trembling. They'll shoot me if I try to cross the bridge. Just take it, she begged. Keep it safe. When this ends, please. I looked at the paper. It could be tainted. It probably was. Taking it was madness. It was suicide. I looked at my gloves, stained and worn. Please, she wept softly. I reached out. I pinched the corner of the parchment and pulled it through the bars. I tucked it deep inside my leather jerkin, against my shirt, right over my heart. I'll keep it, I promised. I swear. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you, Jeff. She knew my name. I closed my eyes, savoring the sound of it. I stood up, feeling a strange surge of energy, a purpose. I wasn't just the bell ringer of death anymore. I was a messenger. I was a vault. But the moment of grace was shattered by a shout. He's peering in the windows. Look at him, spying for the Reaper. I spun around. 3 men stood at the edge of the square. They were rough, faces flushed with gin and fear. I recognized one, the blacksmith. He held a heavy hammer, the others held stones and a pitchfork. No, I said, raising my hands. I was just marking the house, the blacksmith roared. I saw him, breathing his sickness into the cellar. That's how he does it. He spreads it so he keeps his job. Fear makes men stupid, but it also makes them dangerous. They didn't see a man trying to help. They saw a monster. Get him. A stone whizzed past my head, striking the wood of the apothecary's shop with a crack. Another hit my shoulder, spinning me around. The pain was sharp and shocking. Stop, I yelled, grabbing the bell. I'm doing my duty. Your duty is death. They charged. I didn't think. I ran. I grabbed the heavy bell and sprinted, my boots slipping on the slick cobblestones. The cart was too far away to help, and Thomas wouldn't have helped anyway. I ducked down an alleyway, the shouts echoing behind me. Clang, clang, clang went the bell as it banged against my thigh, announcing my flight, giving away my position. I scrambled over a fallen barrel, my breath tearing at my throat. I could hear them behind me, the heavy footfalls of men driven by the madness of survival. I took a sharp left, then a right, diving into the narrow, twisting lanes of the old quarter, the poorest part of town where the houses leaned together until they touched, blocking out the sky. I found a narrow gap between 2 collapsing structures, a space barely wide enough for a man, filled with shadows and discard. I squeezed into it, pressing my back against the slimy wood, clutching the bell to my chest to silence it. I held my breath. The footsteps thundered past the alley mouth. Where did the bastard go? Down towards the river. Hunt him down, break that cursed bell. Their voices faded, drifting away toward the water. I slid down the wall until I was sitting in the mud. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, beating against the parchment I had hidden there. I looked at the bell in my lap. It was scratched, dented, just like me. I hated it. I hated the weight of it. I hated that it was my only companion. Why do I do this? I asked the darkness. Why don't I just lie down here and let the sickness take me? Why keep walking? Because of the paper in my shirt. Because of the voice that called me a good man. Because if I didn't ring the bell, the dead would rot in the houses, and the sickness would spread faster. It was a job that sucked the soul out of you, but it was the dam holding back the total collapse of the world. I sat there for an hour, maybe 2, until the shadows lengthened and the light turned the bruised purple of twilight. It was getting colder. I needed to get back to the church. I needed to regroup. As I prepared to push myself up, to brave the streets again, I heard a noise from the building behind me. The wall I was leaning against vibrating slightly. It wasn't a cough, it wasn't a moan. It was a hum, a melodic rhythmic humming, a lullaby. I froze. This part of town had been marked dead a week ago. The red crosses here were old and peeling. No one came down here. The carts didn't even bother unless the smell got too bad. I pressed my ear against the rotting wood of the wall. Lavender's blue, dilly-dilly, lavender's green. A child, a clearer, cleaner sound than anything I had heard in months. Curiosity, dangerous and foolish, seized me again. I crept out of my hiding spot and moved around to the front of the house. The door was boarded up, heavy planks nailed in an X pattern, but the cellar hatch was obscured by a pile of old hay and refuse. And the hay was moving. I approached slowly, the bell hanging silent at my side. I knelt by the hatch and gently pushed the hay aside. The wood was warped, leaving a gap. I peered into the gloom. A singular candle burned down there, and sitting on a crate, wrapped in a blanket that looked far too expensive for this quarter, was a little boy, no older than 6. He was rocking back and forth, singing to a wooden soldier in his hand. He looked up, he saw my eye through the crack. He didn't scream, he stopped singing. "Are you the bad man?" he asked. His voice was tiny, echoing in the hollow space. "No," I whispered, my throat tight. "No, I'm the bell man." "Mama said I have to be quiet," he said seriously. "She said the bad wind is outside." "Where is your mama?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. The boy pointed to the corner of the cellar, beyond the reach of the candlelight. "She's sleeping. She's been sleeping for a long time. She won't wake up to sing, so I have to do it." My heart broke. It shattered into a million jagged pieces. He was down there with the body. He was breathing the air of the dead. And yet, looking at his face in the candlelight, he looked flush. He looked alive. If I rang the bell, the cart would come. They would take the mother. But what would they do with him? There were no orphanages left. They would put him in the pest house, where he would surely die. Or I could walk away, leave him to starve. No. I looked at the sky. It was almost dark. The hateful, stone-throwing men were gone. The village was locking its doors for the night. I made a decision that broke every rule of my office, every law of the king, and every instinct of self-preservation. I unhooked the heavy iron clapper from the inside of my bell. I wrapped it in a rag so it wouldn't clang. "What's your name, son?" I whispered through the crack. "Leo," he said. "Leo," I said, trying to make my voice sound like the Jeff of old, the Jeff who announced the fair. "I'm going to get you out of there, but you have to be very brave. You have to be quiet as a mouse. Can you do that?" He nodded solemnly. "I'm good at being a mouse." I wedged my fingers under the cellar doors. They were heavy, swollen with damp, but I pulled. I pulled with the anger of the stones thrown at me. I pulled with the grief of my empty bed. I pulled with the strength of a man who refuses to be just a ringer of death. The wood groaned and gave way. The smell of the cellar hit me, decay, yes, but also wax and life. I reached down. "Come not, Leo, take my hand." He hesitated, looking back at the dark corner where his mother lay. "She wants you to go," I lied. It was the holiest lie I had ever told. "She wants you to come with me." Leo stood up. He clutched his wooden soldier. He reached up, his small hand disappearing into my gloved one. I pulled him up into the twilight. He was light, so light. I pulled him close, wrapping my cloak around him to hide him from the prying eyes of the shutters. "Where are we going?" he whispered into my chest. "Away," I said. "To the bell tower, it's the highest place. The air is clean there." I picked up my bell. It was silent now, the tongue removed. I wasn't a bell ringer anymore. I was a guardian. I looked down the empty, fog-choked street. The night was coming, full of terrors and silence. But for the first time since the plague star rose, I wasn't just walking through the dark. I was carrying a light. I adjusted the boy's weight on my hip, ignored the screaming of my tired muscles, and began the long walk toward the church spire. The bell didn't ring. My boots didn't drag. I walked with purpose. The job still sucked, but tonight I wasn't working for the plague. I was working for Leo, and that made all the difference. Equals. The frost came early that year, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the The cold was not a herald of hardship, but a mercy. I remember stepping onto the cobblestones, the leather of my boots stiff and cracking, and feeling a sharp bite in the air that scoured the back of my throat. It was a clean feeling. For months, the air had been thick, a physical thing you had to push through, a soup of wood smoke, vinegar, burning herbs, and the cloying, sweet-rot stench of the sickness. But that morning, the frost lay like a dusting of crushed diamonds over the village, glittering on the thatched roofs and the silent carts. And with the cold, the fleas died. We didn't know that was the mechanics of it then, of course. We only knew that the devil seemed to hate the chill as much as we had come to crave it. I gripped the handle of the handcart, my knuckles white, preparing for the weight. It was a muscle memory so ingrained that my body braced itself before my mind even engaged. I reached for the bell hanging at my belt, that heavy, iron gobbet of misery that had defined my existence. I gave it a shake. Clang. It rang out, sharp and piercing in the thin air. Usually that sound was a summons. It was the sound that made mothers weep behind shuttered windows and grown men cross themselves in shadows. It was the sound of the end. But that morning, as the reverberation faded into the gray sky, nothing happened. I walked the first street, silence. I walked the second, past the baker's house, which had been boarded up for 3 weeks. Silence. I turned the corner toward the plaza, the wheels of my cart rumbling loudly on the stones because there were no moans to drown them out. There was no one to collect. I stopped in the center of the square. The wind rushed through the alleyways, whistling through the gaps in the timber frames, and I stood there, the bell silent in my hand, feeling a frantic confusion rising in my chest. It was a conditioning, you see. I had been the bell ringer of the plague for so long that I didn't know who I was without a corpse to answer my call. I felt a phantom weight in the cart, a ghost of the burden I had hauled day in and day out. But looking back, the wood was bare, dusted only with that saving frost. It didn't happen all at once. The plague didn't pack its bags and leave town by noon. But that empty cart was the beginning of the end, the first deep inhalation of a world that had forgotten how to breathe. In the weeks that followed, the thaw began. Not just of the ice, but of the people. And that is when the true weight of what I had done, of what this job had actually been, finally settled on my shoulders. When you are in the eye of the storm, you just survive. You ring, you walk, you lift, you burn, you don't think. But as the doors began to crack open, just an inch at first, peering out into the pale sunlight, I had to face the reflection of what I had become to them. That was the part they never put in the songs or the histories. They tell you about the heroism of the doctors with their beak masks, or the priests who gave last rites until they collapsed. They don't tell you about the bell ringer. To be the ringer was to be the angel of death's ugly little cousin. I was necessary, yes. Vital, even. Without me, the rot would have consumed the living. But looking into the eyes of the survivors as they emerged from their self-imposed tombs, I saw the flinch. I remember walking past old Miller's place. He was a hard man, forged from gristle and flour dust, who had buried his wife and 2 sons. He was sitting on his stoop, blinking in the daylight, whittling a piece of ash wood. When I approached, just walking, mind you, not ringing, his hands went still. He looked at the bell at my hip. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the iron. And in his eyes, I saw a flash of terror so raw it made my stomach turn. I was a walking trigger. I was the trauma wearing a coat. That's why it sucked. It wasn't the smell, though God knows that lingers in my nose to this day. It wasn't the labor. It was the isolation. I had saved them in my own way by clearing the rot, but I could never be one of them again. Not really. I was the man who knew what everyone's dead loved ones looked like in their final, undignified moments. I held the secrets of their grief. But there is a stubbornness to life, a green shoot pushing through the blackened earth that refuses to be denied. The recovery was slow, agonizingly so. The village was missing teeth, whole houses stood empty, staring like skulls with hollow eye sockets. We had lost the blacksmith, the priest, and half the choir. The silence in the evenings was heavy, missing the laughter of children who were no longer there to play. Yet the routine shifted. One morning, the town council, or what was left of it, mostly the tanner and a retired soldier named Ivor, summoned me. I expected to be dismissed. I expected to be told to take my bell and my cart and vanish, to take the bad memories with me. Ivor looked at me, his face scarred and weary. "Jeff," he said, his voice rasping, "the clock tower mechanism, the ropes are rotted, the chains are rusted solid. No one has tended to the time since the burning started." I nodded, unsure where this was going. "We need the hours, Jeff," he said quietly. "We need to know when the day starts and when it ends. We need to know that time is moving forward again. Can you ring it?" Not the handbell, the great bell. The one high above the square, the one that used to sing out for weddings and market days. "I can," I said. My voice sounded rusty to my own ears. The climb up the tower was grueling. The stairs were thick with dust and cobwebs, the air stale, but when I reached the belfry, the wind was fresh. I looked out over the village. From up there, you couldn't see the pockmarks of the disease. You just saw the sweep of the rooftops, the smoke curling from chimneys, the green of the forest beyond. It looked peaceful. It looked like a place worth saving. I dedicated myself to the great bell with the same grim determination I had given the dead cart. I scrubbed the rust. I greased the gears with tallow. I replaced the frayed ropes. And then I rang it. Bang! The sound was so deep, so resonant, it vibrated in the marrow of my bones. It wasn't the sharp, frantic clang of the plague bell. It was a low, enduring hum that rolled over the valley. Down below, I saw people stop. They stopped in the streets, they stopped in their gardens. They looked up. It was noon. For the first time in a year, it was officially, undeniably noon. That bell became my penance and my redemption. It gave me a reason to be Jeff the timekeeper, not Jeff the undertaker. But the transition wasn't seamless. There were nights, dark and moonless, where I would wake up sweating, the phantom smell of vinegar in my nose, hearing the rattle of the cart wheels. I would walk the streets alone, just to make sure they were empty. It was on one of these midnight walks that I passed the widow Alara's house. She had been the one who screamed the loudest when I took her husband. She had thrown a stone at me, hitting me in the shoulder, calling me a vulture. I had never blamed her. Grief is a madness. I saw a light in her window and heard a sound. A rhythmic, scraping sound. I hesitated, fear prickling my neck. Was it the sickness back again? Was she digging a grave in her cellar? I crept closer, stepping carefully to avoid the creaking boards of her porch. I peered through the crack in the shutter. She wasn't digging. She was kneading dough. She was covered in flour, pounding the bread with a ferocity that spoke of anger and survival. And she was humming. A broken, tuneless melody, but a song nonetheless. I stepped back, terrified she would see me, but my boot caught a loose stone. It skittered across the path. The humming stopped, the shutter threw open. Alara stood there, a candle in her hand, illuminating her tired face. She saw me, the man in the heavy coat, the ringer. I froze, waiting for the stone, waiting for the curse. She lowered the candle. She looked at my hands, empty of the bell. She looked at my face, really looked at it, perhaps for the first time. She saw the dark circles under my eyes, the way my shoulders slumped. She saw that I was just a man who had done a job that no man should have to do. "Jeff," she said softly. "I'm sorry, Alara," I stammered. "I was just walking." She looked at the dark street behind me. Is there news?" "No," I said quickly. "No news, just quiet, just the night." She let out a breath that shuddered through her entire frame. "Just the night," she repeated. She looked down at the dough on her hands. "I'm making bread, for the morning, first time." "That's good," I said. That's hopeful." She hesitated, then reached for the sill. "It's too much for one, the flour. It goes bad if you don't use it." She paused. "Come by at dawn, Jeff. There will be a loaf on the step." She closed the shutter before I could answer. I stood there in the dark, tears stinging my eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. You don't forgive the lightning for striking the tree. But it was an acknowledgement. I was part of the village again. I was someone who needed to eat. That loaf of bread, warm and wrapped in a linen cloth, waiting for me as the sun crested the hills the next morning, tasted better than any banquet I will ever know. It tasted like grace. As the seasons turned, spring bleeding into a lush, riotous summer, the scars of the village began to hide themselves under flowers. Ivy climbed the boarded-up houses, softening their skeletal appearance. New families moved in from the coast, wary strangers who didn't know the specific geography of our sorrow. To them, I was just the guy who rang the noon bell. They didn't know why the older folks sometimes went quiet when I walked into the tavern. Personal growth is a strange thing. I had always been a happy man before. A simple man. I liked my ale, I liked the sun on my face, I liked the symmetry of ringing a bell. I was naive. I thought courage was something soldiers had, something that involved swords and shields. I learned that courage sits in a quiet room waiting for a fever to break. I learned that courage is walking up to a door marked with a red cross, knowing what's inside, and opening it anyway because dignity demands it. I was no longer that simple, happy man. I was weary. I felt older than the stones of the church, but I was also solid. I had walked through the valley of the shadow of death, and I had come out the other side with my boots on. The fear of the plague never truly left us. It became a shadow in the corner of our eyes. Every cough in the market square drew sharp glances. Every dead rat found in a cellar caused a panic. But we handled it. We washed our hands. We burnt the refuse. We looked out for one another with a fierce, protective suspicion. And I kept ringing. The job that sucked, the job that ate my soul little by little, had transformed. Or maybe it hadn't. Maybe the job was always the same, and it was the world that changed around it. The bell is just metal. It amplifies the intent of the ringer. When I rang it with fear, it sowed terror. Now I rang it with gratitude. One evening, late in the summer, the village held a festival. It was the feast of Saint Roch, the patron of plague sufferers. It was a somber affair at first, a lot of prayers and candles. But then the fiddles started. The ale flowed. People remembered that being alive was a thing to be celebrated, not just endured. I stood at the edge of the bonfire, watching. I saw the blacksmith's apprentice dancing with the tanner's daughter. I saw Alara laughing, her head thrown back, a sound I hadn't heard in years. I felt a tug on my sleeve. It was a little boy, maybe 6 years old. He had been a toddler when the sickness passed him by. He held out a stick. "Mr. Jeff," he asked. "Yes, lad." "Mida says you rang the monsters away." I looked across the fire at his father, a man whose name I couldn't recall, but whose face I remembered pale and sweating in a delirious fever I had helped nurse him through. The father raised his tankard to me, a silent toast. I looked back at the boy. "Not the monsters," I said, crouched down to his level. "I just rang the bell to let the sun know it was safe to come back." The boy considered this, his eyes wide. "Can I ring it?" I smiled. "One day, when you're bigger, it's heavy work." "I'm strong," he insisted. "I bet you are," I said, and I meant it. He was the generation that survived. He was iron. As the fire burned down to embers, I walked away from the noise and the light, heading back toward the tower. The steps were familiar now, a comfort. I climbed up into the cool darkness of the belfry. I sat on the wooden bench, the great bell hanging silently above me, a massive silhouette against the starry sky. I thought about the title I had given my life in my head, the Plague Bell Ringer. It sounded like a curse. But sitting there, listening to the distant sound of life continuing below, I realized it was a title of honor. It sucked, God, it sucked. It broke my heart 1,000 times. It made me hate the sound of my own footsteps. It made me question the mercy of the Almighty. But someone had to do it. Someone had to walk into the dark so others could find the light. Someone had to carry the weight so the rest could eventually stand tall again. I reached out and placed my hand on the cold metal of the bell. It hummed, just slightly, resonating with the wind. "We made it," I whispered to the iron. "We made it." I didn't ring it then. The silence was too perfect to break. The village was sleeping or loving or dreaming. They didn't need the time. They didn't need a warning. They just needed to know that the sentinel was there, watching over the quiet. I leaned back against the stone wall, closing my eyes. The smell of the sickness was gone, replaced by the scent of roasted meat and summer grass. The fear was a memory, scarring over into wisdom. Being a plague bell ringer sucked, but being the man who put the bell down, being the man who stayed. That was the greatest privilege of my life. I listened to the wind for a long time, until the fire died down below and the stars wheeled overhead, marking the passing of a time that belonged to us again. And in that high, quiet place, Jeff the bell ringer finally found his peace.